He had built an empire, amassed fortune and power, but none of this prepared him for what was about to happen. At the height of his success, Mark believed he had everything the world could offer, until an unexpected phone call turned his life upside down. A voice from the past, a name he hadn't heard for years, Lara. Suddenly forgotten memories came back like a storm, a love he thought he had left behind. But what began as a simple reunion soon revealed buried secrets and an inescapable truth. Some promises should never be broken. Now, faced with the woman who once meant everything to him, Mark must face a choice that no amount of money can buy. Fate has given him a second chance, but is he ready to risk everything for a love that should never have been forgotten? The sound of crystal glasses resounded through the large meeting room. Mark was sitting at the head of the dark mahogany table, surrounded by executives and lawyers. The big screen displayed rising graphs while one of the directors talked about the company's new acquisition. He should have been pleased, but for the first time in a long time, he couldn't concentrate. His cell phone vibrated discreetly on the table. An unknown number. Normally, he would have ignored it, but for no apparent reason, he felt a strange impulse and answered. "Hello?" A brief pause. Then a female voice, soft but hesitant. "Mark, I don't know if you remember me." He frowned. Something in that voice sent a shiver down his spine. "Who's this?" "It's Lara." The name clicked in his mind like a match being struck in the dark. Lara. Her childhood, his adolescence, the first person he had ever loved. He leaned forward, his heart hammering in his chest. "Lara, how did you find me?" She let out a nervous laugh. "I never let you out of my sight, really. But it was only now that I had the courage to call you." All eyes around the table began to turn to him. Mark cleared his throat and stood up. "Give me a minute." He went out into the corridor, his head spinning. "What do you mean?" "I'll explain in person. Can we meet?" Mark hesitated. His instinct told him to say no. He was no longer that dreamy boy from the past, but against all logic, he heard his own voice reply, "Tomorrow, 10 a.m. Meet me at the cafe around the corner from my office. I'll be there." The phone went silent. Mark stood still for a few moments, processing what had just happened. He hadn't thought about Lara for years, or at least that's what he told himself. That night, lying in his king-size bed, her face appeared in his mind like a ghost, her hair blowing in the wind, her eyes shining in the sunlight of childhood. He remembered the endless afternoons in the park, the conversations under the stars. Then an unexpected memory hit him, a promise. "If we ever part, I promise I'll be back." He turned over in bed, annoyed. That was nonsense. The past was buried. Tomorrow he would meet Lara, end the story once and for all, and get back to his life. Or so he wanted to believe. Mark parked the car in front of the cafe. He felt the engine go quiet, but inside everything seemed noisy. He didn't know what to expect. As he walked in, he spotted Lara immediately. Time had passed, but she still had the same essence, the loose hair, the discreet smile, the way she stirred her coffee without haste. He approached, and when she raised her eyes, something inside him wavered. "You came," she said with a genuine smile. "I told you I'd come," he replied, pulling out a chair and sitting down. There was silence for a moment. Lara seemed to measure her words, as if she didn't know where to start. "You're different, Mark," she said at last. More serious. He let out a slight laugh through his nose. "Time does that to us." She tilted her head slightly, watching him. "Does it really? Or do we force ourselves to change in order to forget who we once were?" Mark looked away. "I don't know. Maybe a bit of both." The waiter appeared and Lara ordered another coffee. Mark just made a gesture of denial. "So, what made you come to me?" he asked. She took a deep breath before answering. "I kept something of yours. For years. I thought it was time to give it back." Mark frowned. "Something of mine?" Lara opened her bag and took out a small wooden box, slightly weathered. She placed it on the table and slid it towards him. "Open it." He hesitated. There was something unsettling about that moment. Part of him wanted to take the box and see what was inside. Another part feared what he might find. Mark touched the lid and slowly opened it. Inside were old letters, carefully folded, some faded photos and an unfinished note. As he picked up the note, he felt a pang in his chest. The handwriting was his. Lara watched his every reaction. "Do you remember this?" He swallowed, his eyes scanning the words written on the paper. It was a promise. "If we ever part, I promise I'll be back." The phrase hammered through Mark's mind like a distant echo. He vaguely remembered writing something like that, but he couldn't remember why or when. Lara crossed her arms, waiting. "So?" she asked. "Does that remind you of anything?" He took a deep breath, feeling an unfamiliar weight on his chest. "I don't know." And that was the scariest truth of all. Mark kept his eyes fixed on the note. The words seemed like an enigma, a distant memory that his mind tried to access, but something blocked it. He turned the sheet over in his hands, as if by touching it he could extract more of the lost memory. "You wrote this for me," said Lara, her voice low, almost a whisper. Mark looked up. "I don't remember." She took a deep breath and leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms. "I'm not surprised. You've always been good at burying the past." The phrase struck him in a strange way. He opened the box and pulled out some photos. There they both were, still teenagers, smiling at the camera. In one of the pictures, they were sitting by a lake, their hands intertwined. He slid his thumb over the photo. "We were happy, weren't we?" Lara smiled in a humorless way. "We were, until you decided to leave and never look back." Mark closed his eyes for a moment. Now he was beginning to remember, not the exact words, but the feeling. He remembered the time they were together, the summer they spent planning for the future, and then the goodbye. "I left to study," he said, trying to justify it. "I wanted to get my life together." "And you did," she replied, gesturing around. "You have everything you ever wanted." Mark couldn't say why that sounded like an accusation. "I tried to write to you," he muttered. Lara let out a short, incredulous laugh. "You tried?" "I wrote to you, Mark, for months. I waited for a reply that never came." He frowned. "I never received anything." She tilted her head, gauging his reaction. "Maybe it's because you've changed so much that you didn't want to receive it." Mark felt a knot forming in his stomach. He looked again at the letters inside the box. Letters he'd never seen. "I swear, Lara, I never received them." She watched his expression and sighed. "It doesn't matter anymore. I kept that box because somehow it still meant something to me. But today I can finally get rid of it." Lara stood up, pulling on her coat. "Thank you for coming, Mark. That's all I wanted." He felt the moment slip through his fingers. "Lara, wait." She stopped, but didn't turn around. "What?" Mark held the box, the letters, the photos. Suddenly he felt that if he let her go, he'd be missing out on something he didn't even know he was looking for. "Can we talk about this more?" She was silent for a few seconds. Then, without looking at him, she answered, "Let me know when you're sure what you want, Mark." And she left, leaving him alone with his unfinished memories. Mark sat in the cafe for a few more minutes, staring at the box on the table. The coffee cooled in his cup, but he didn't move. The meeting with Lara had left him restless, a strange feeling that something inside him was incomplete. The next day, he gave in to impulse and sent her a message. "I want to talk. Can we meet?" The reply came shortly afterwards. "All right, tonight at 8 p.m. Mark spent the day restless. Business that had once seemed urgent became mere background noise. In the evening, he put on a casual blazer and went to the restaurant where they had agreed. When Lara arrived, he noticed that she still had that serene manner, as if time had shaped her features, but not her essence. "I thought you weren't coming," she said, taking a seat. "I thought so too." A slight smile formed on her lips. The waiter appeared and they both ordered wine. Mark took advantage of the moment of silence to take a closer look at her. It was strange. He remembered her as the girl he knew, but now he saw a woman he still didn't know completely. "You're silent," commented Lara, raising her glass. "I'm trying to understand why it took me so long to remember you." She laughed softly. "You haven't forgotten me, Mark. You've just buried it somewhere deep down." He leaned his elbows on the table and sighed. "What happened after I left?" Lara twirled the cup between her fingers. "I tried to move on. At first, I waited for your letters, your calls. Then I stopped waiting. I had to live my life." Mark nodded slowly. "And did you succeed?" She hesitated for a moment. "Yes, I got married." The silence that followed was heavy. Mark blinked a few times as if his mind needed to process the information. "Married," he repeated as if testing the word. Lara watched him, trying to decipher his expression. "He was a good man," she continued, "but life gives us paths we don't expect." Mark noticed the tone of melancholy in her voice. "What happened?" Lara took a deep breath, looking into her wine before answering. "He passed away a year ago." Mark felt a tightness in his chest. He didn't know what to say. "I'm sorry." She smiled sadly. "Thank you, Mark." The waiter brought the plates, but Mark barely touched the food. His mind was immersed in memories. What could have been? What could still be? "What now?" he asked softly. Lara looked up at him. "Now I just try to move on." Mark realized that perhaps he was about to do the same. Over the next few days, Mark tried to get back into his routine, but something was different. He found himself distracted in meetings, signing contracts without actually reading them and ignoring important calls. His assistant noticed the change. "Is everything all right, sir?" Mark just nodded, but he knew the answer was no. In the evening, sitting in his luxurious apartment, he looked out at the city through the glass wall. Everything he had built was there: success, wealth, power. But for the first time, it all seemed meaningless. His phone vibrated on the table. "Lara, can we talk?" He didn't hesitate. He grabbed his car keys and drove to the address she had sent. It was a quiet park, lit by yellowish street lamps. Lara was sitting on a bench, her arms crossed against the cold night wind. "I didn't think you'd come," she said, seeing him approach. "I had to come." He sat down next to her. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable, but it carried something unspoken. "I lied to you that night," Lara suddenly confessed. Mark frowned. "What do you mean?" She turned to face him. "When I said I'd moved on." He felt his heart race. "What do you mean?" Lara sighed, absent-mindedly fiddling with her fingers. "When you left, I tried. I really tried. But I always wondered, what if?" Mark felt a tightness in his throat. "What if what?" She turned her face to him. "What if you had stayed? What if we'd tried?" The air around them seemed denser. He knew he'd thought about it too, many times. "I wonder that too," he admitted. Lara smiled. "But life isn't about what ifs, Mark. It happens, regardless of our doubts." Mark held his chin thoughtfully. "Do you still have feelings for me?" Lara looked away, but didn't answer right away. "I miss what we were. But I don't know if that means we can be something now." The wind blew harder, and she wrapped her arms around herself. Mark took off his jacket and draped it over her shoulders. "What if I said I wanted to try?" Lara closed her eyes for a moment. "I'd say you need to be sure of what you want." Mark sighed, looking up at the dark sky. "I've never been so sure of anything." She stared at him, as if trying to find the truth behind his words. "Then prove it to me." The challenge was on. Mark spent the next few days trying to figure out what to do. He wanted Lara back, but he knew that words wouldn't be enough. He needed to show that he was willing to give up his calculated world to allow something real to flourish again. However, routine pulled him back into his old life, his busy schedule, the unavoidable appointments, the endless business dinners. He wanted to believe that he could reconcile everything, but the weight of uncertainty was growing inside him. One evening, after yet another exhausting meeting, Mark found himself driving nowhere. Without realizing it, he stopped in front of Lara's house. The small garden was illuminated by the yellowish light from the balcony. He took a deep breath before getting out of the car. When he rang the doorbell, he heard hesitant footsteps. The door opened and Lara appeared, surprised. "Mark, what are you doing here?" He hesitated for a moment before answering. "I needed to see you." She watched him for a moment and then opened the door a little wider. "Come in." The interior of the house was cozy, unlike the sophisticated places he was used to. The smell of coffee still hung in the air, and a book lay open on the living room table. Mark looked around, absorbing the atmosphere that seemed so different from his own world. "You look tired," commented Lara, closing the door. I am, but not just because of work." She crossed her arms. "Then why?" Mark ran his hands through his hair, frustrated with himself. "Because I don't know what to do with it all anymore. With this mess inside me." Lara looked at him carefully. "You're afraid, aren't you?" He laughed humorlessly. "Afraid of what?" "Of feeling. Of giving yourself up. You've spent so long building this wall around yourself that now you don't know how to break it down." Mark remained silent. It was true. He knew it. "Maybe you're right." Lara stepped forward, looking straight into his eyes. "You need to decide, Mark, whether you want to carry on living the life you have or whether you want something new. But you can't have both." He felt a lump in his throat. For the first time, he realized that he would have to make a real choice. "What if I said I was willing to try?" Lara smiled slightly, but there was something skeptical in her gaze. "Then prove it to me." Mark nodded slowly. "I'll prove it." Doubt still hung in the air, but for the first time, he felt he was ready to take a risk. In the days that followed, Mark tried to carry on with his life as normal. He tried to convince himself that he could balance everything, his business, his intense routine, and at the same time his promise to Lara, but he soon realized that this was an illusion. Meetings became empty. The numbers and contracts that used to be all that mattered now seemed lifeless. And deep down, a corrosive doubt was growing inside him. He didn't seek her out immediately, not because he didn't want to, but because he knew that in order to prove something to Lara, he first had to prove to himself that he was willing to change. Then, one evening, as he was leaving the office late, something caught his eye. In the distance, on a busy sidewalk, he saw Lara. She was standing in front of a cab, putting some suitcases in the back seat. A shock ran through his body. He crossed the street quickly, dodging people in a hurry. "Lara!" She turned around in surprise. "Mark, what are you doing here?" He stopped in front of her, still trying to understand what was going on. "What does this mean?" She looked at the suitcases and then at him. "I'm leaving." Mark's heart raced. Leaving for where? Lara took a deep breath, seeming to choose her words carefully. A new job, a new life. Something far away from here. He felt a tightness in his chest. "You were just going to leave without telling me?" She held his gaze. "You asked for time to think, Mark. I did. Now it's time for me to think about myself." The taxi driver snorted impatiently. Mark ignored it. "Don't go." Lara smiled, but there was sadness in her eyes. "Give me a good reason to stay." Mark swallowed. He had never been so close to losing something that really mattered. "Because I need you." She shook her head. "No, that's not enough. You need to know what you want." The taxi driver started the engine. Lara hesitated for a moment, but then opened the car door. Desperation overtook Mark. "I love you!" Lara froze. He himself was surprised by the words, but he knew they were true. She slowly turned to face him. "Are you sure about this?" Mark took a step forward. "I've never been so sure of anything in my life." She was silent for a long moment. Then she closed the cab door. "Then prove it to me, Mark." And this time, he knew he wouldn't let her go. The cab drove off, but Lara wasn't in it. She stood there on the sidewalk, watching Mark as if trying to see inside him. He felt his heart beating fast, but he didn't look away. "Do you really think you can change?" she asked, crossing her arms. Mark took a step closer, feeling the cold of the night on his skin. "I don't think so, I do." She let out a low, humorless laugh. "It's easy to say that now, Mark. But when the routine pulls you back, when work consumes you again, he shook his head. None of that matters without you. Lara stared at him for a long moment. Then she sighed. Are you really willing to leave all this behind? Mark hesitated for a moment. He had built his entire life on work, ambition, and success. But what good was it if, at the end of the day, he felt empty? If it means having you by my side, yes. She bit her lip, as if fighting her own feelings. I don't want to be an impulsive choice. Mark took her hands, feeling the warmth of her skin against his. It's not impulsive, Lara. I spent years thinking that happiness was synonymous with success, but since I met you again, I've realized that I was wrong. She looked away, clearly moved but still reluctant. I'm afraid to believe that. Mark let out a sigh and gently lifted her face so that she could look him in the eye. Then let me prove it to you. She remained silent. The taxi driver, realizing he wouldn't have a passenger, sped off and disappeared down the street. What do you want to do? She asked at last. Mark smiled slightly. I want to start again. I want to get to know you again. I want us to create a new story, with no broken promises, no unresolved pasts. Lara blinked a few times, and a small smile appeared on her lips. That sounds dangerous and wonderful. She laughed softly, and at that moment, Mark knew he had won the hardest battle of his life. All right then, but I'm going to hold you to that promise. You can. Slowly, she moved closer, and Mark wrapped his arms around her. The kiss came naturally, as if the years between them had never existed. It was a fresh start, and this time he wasn't going to let it go.